Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with James Boyle, who is a professor of law at Duke University's Law School, also former chair of the Creative Commons, and also the founder of the Center for the Study of Public Domain, also the author of a number of books. The most recent book is this one called The Line, AI and the Future of Personhood, which of course is about far more than just AI. And then you've got a couple other books, this other one called The Public Domain, Enclosing the Commons of the Mind. And before that, one called Shamans, Software and Spleens, Law and the Constitution of the Information Society. Welcome, James.
Very nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, look, I really like this book because it obviously crosses a lot of different domains, which I guess is the price of admission to this podcast. And it's clearly about a lot more than what we might think of as personhood. I mean, there's philosophical approaches, there's literary approaches, and of course, as a lawyer, there are these legal approaches. And you have to bring in discussions about corporations and about non-human animals, because I think we've been grappling with this idea of the line, the boundary between humans and non-humans, legally and philosophically, for as long as we've been humans. And so, like any good law book, this is not only something which looks to the past, but also makes predictions about the future. And it's not just descriptive, just describing how we've approached these issues, but it's also somewhat prescriptive, giving us some guidance on maybe how we should be thinking about it. And I guess the question is, when we start dealing with these legal cases, and I think we're already they're already starting to pop up. Will we be prepared to engage these questions?
The short answer to that one is I don't think so, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I'll say quickly that I don't think that it's likely that the first time we confront these issues will be in a courtroom. Down the line, perhaps. If you think about the environmental movement, people making claims on behalf of landscapes or mountains or trees, and eventually moving towards the idea of personhood, or people who started out trying to say we should be nicer to non-human animals. They start with prevention of cruelty to animals and animal ethics. And now there are cases being brought that saying that we, at least with the great apes and perhaps the cetaceans, that we should give them some greater acknowledgement that just these are animals, that these are beings with so many of the capacities that we think are important in setting us apart from the rest of the world, that we're kind of honor bound, logic bound, morally bound to extend greater respect to them. And those finally are coming up in courtrooms. But I think frequently the courtroom is the end of a drama, the first four acts of which are fought out in literature, in film, in popular discussions, in moral confusion, in articles in newspapers, in people just saying, wow, that response from ChatGPT was eerie. What happens when it's not just a chatbot anymore in the 15th generation from now, when the architecture is totally different? So I think that at that point the courts might get involved, and I have some guesses about how that might go. But I think the wind up, and this is what the book really tries to say, is we don't think about these issues in one silo, to give the name of your podcast. We deploy art, we deploy our empathy, we deploy our economic reasoning, we think about how we've treated corporations, how we treated non-human animals. And all of those things come together, I think, in the way that we're thinking about it. And the book is, I think you put it nicely, it's not really an attempt to tell you what you should think, but it is an attempt in the sort of tradition of the humanities to say, maybe this is how to think about these issues.
Well, I mean, there's two possible stories going on here. I mean, one is the way in which we change our definition of what humans are and where the line is drawn. And, there's this grand liberal story, this Whig story, I guess it is, where we've been expanding the scope, right? There was a time when, women were considered, partial humans, and people of different ethnicities or nationalities or races weren't considered part of the folks inside the line. And so been this expanding of the circle. And a lot of the folks who believe in animal rights think that, animals should be brought within. And that's the continuation of the story. But there's another piece here, which is that, that story's been going on without there being any kind of fundamental change in the nature of the things that we've been thinking about. But technology has essentially created the possibility that new forms of organisms and new forms of intelligences will evolve. And so even if we were to keep our boundaries constant, there would start to be these things which would start to, move potentially inside the line. And so, we have to think about these issues now in ways that we probably never had to before.
That's certainly my argument. I'm glad to have a sympathetic audience. And I think, this is, as you said, unlike what we've done before. One is, as you pointed out, the fact that it's an entirely new technology. It's not, after all, Aristotle was reasoning how we were different from non-human animals and doing a pretty good job, actually, 2,300 years ago. But this is something new. But there's a second thing, I think, which sort of goes along with that, which is we are actually designing these entities. And so whatever our criteria are, wherever we choose to set the bar, we can perhaps choose to create over or just under that line. And in the book, I have a thought experiment in dealing with the chimpy, a fictional transgenic species combining the DNA of humans and chimpanzees, which is designed not to form unions, have an IQ of 60, and be loyal and biddable, and use sign language. And in my fictional inventor, on being told that he is undercutting the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, says, I am their creator and I gave them no such rights. That's new. That's a first. And I think that one is probably one of the things that is going to give us the greatest pause here. For some people, it will be, but what hubris? To create a life is something that the deity can do, and only the deity can do. Insert your, preferred deity, world spirit, Gaia, what have you. And I think a lot of people will have that reaction and will say this is hubris and sin, and arguably idolatry, breaching the first commandment. I think other people will say anything that is the child of our own brains must therefore serve us, in the same way as we used to believe that our children were basically, had to be our servants, and sort of like, and that was the purpose for having them. And there will be still others who will say, well, that means that this debate about morally salient qualities is just very different, because what we can do now is simply, if we want to, just make it an idiot savant and leave it just whatever it is, our criteria is, just leave it 6 inches short. And people will be debating the ethics of that. So all of those components, I think, are, as you point out, dramatically new.
Right. So in other words, the technology and the law are going to co-evolve, and there's going to be some back and forth. Just like if you define what the employment relationship is, and you don't want, right, your relationship to fall in that bucket, then you just design the relationship so that it's missing some key features so that all of those obligations don't kick in, right?
Right. Just like Uber trying to make sure that it's only employing gig workers and not actual employees in California. But in this case, it would be Uber actually literally designing the workers so that they lack the characteristics which would give them certain rights. And I think for a lot of people, including me, that is a profoundly morally troubling set of ideas.
Right. Now, you begin the book with a couple of stories drawn from the news, right? Because with generative AI, there have been a lot of people who are kind of, I don't know, surprised and stunned by how human-like it can be, right? So, the famous Kevin Roose article in the New York Times, right, where the Sydney or Bing product, right, proposed to him and tried to get him to run away. And then there was the developer at Google who imputed some kind of consciousness to Google's product. I mean, you say that this is clearly an error, that this is not at the level of human intelligence. Now, do you say that because of the characteristics that it exhibits, or because of what you know about how it's designed?
More because of the characteristics of the back end. That this is something which is brilliant at syntax and understands nothing about semantics. Um, as you probably know, there's this philosopher, John Searle, who argued that it would be impossible for us ever to have machine intelligence. And he compared it to the Chinese room, which was a man who doesn't speak Mandarin having, slips with Chinese characters handed to him through a box. But he has an elaborate set of rules inside the box to say, if you get this shaped character, pass back this character in return. And so what he appears to be doing to the Mandarin speaker outside is conducting a fluent conversation in Chinese. But of course, there's no understanding whatsoever. And that's actually, now Searle thinks that's a description of all possible machine intelligences. And I think that's wrong, both technically and philosophically, for reasons I go into in the book. But it's certainly a very good description of ChatGPT and of chatbots, because what this is something that has sort of ingested all of these words, learned the patterns within them, and when I feed it this pattern, it gives me back something that it has learned because of its neural net is likely to match. It's an autocomplete machine on a gigantic scale. And that's not what we understand as consciousness. But it has done one thing, which is the way that we as humans have generally drawn the line and said, this is what makes us different from other entities, from animals, all the way back to Aristotle, is say we have language. And language is what sets us apart. It's this highly complex, highly abstract, the kind of discussion that, yes, non-human animals' languages are much richer than we have known, but they aren't having conversations like this. That's just not true. And so we've got that, and Aristotle goes, well, great, that's what it is to be human, because it, first of all, allows us to reason instrumentally. I'm hungry. I see grapes. I'm going to grab the grapes. Hold on, I can't reach them. Help me. Like, I'll stand in your hands. And then it's like, oh no, that's our neighbor's grapes. This is Greg's grapes. We shouldn't be taking Greg's grapes. He's a nice guy. And that also allows us to reason not just instrumentally, but morally. And Aristotle says, so that's it. That's the thing that sets us above non-human animals and things, because it lets us form the polis, the city-state, the family. And here's the thing is ChatGPT has no consciousness, but it does have language, just not intentional language. And so basically, we've gone wrong thinking that sentences imply sentience. When Turing tried to come up with a test for can machines think? Same test as Aristotle 2,000 years before. He goes, can you have a conversation with it and basically be fooled? And ChatGPT tells us that cannot alone be the test.
But I mean, are we moving the goalposts, right? I mean, when the Turing test was first articulated, it sounded fairly reasonable. It's like, okay, if it can fool you, then it's going to be like a human, right? But we now know that these things fool people all the time, but we know that they're not human. So now, are we just demanding more of these agents than we did in the past? I mean, I love how you quote B.F. Skinner, and you highlight how all of these new developments in generative AI have made us realize how computationally shallow, right, language is, and maybe art is, and a lot of these other things that we thought of as uniquely human.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, B.F. Skinner says the question is not whether a machine thinks, but whether a man does. And Turing himself said, well, here's the thing about my test. The reason you should accept it is because if you set a higher bar, can you pass it yourself? And if you can't, who are you to say that the machine isn't sentient? So there's a certain sort of sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. You said, are we moving the goalposts? And I think we're definitely changing the line. And the question is that just out of defensiveness? Are we now like a corporation who wants to keep its tax breaks, sort of redefining itself just to stay inside so that it's just covered and nothing else is? Are we doing this instead because these new entities have given us insights that, well, no, that's not what we meant. It isn't just the patterns of words themselves. It's the thinking mind behind them. It isn't just the pretty picture. It's that that picture comes from a human person, from a soul, from a set of experiences that communicates to me. Guernica drawn by Dali means nothing, right? Guernica painted by Pablo Picasso says this is the horror of the Spanish Civil War, and I know about that horror firsthand. That's just a dramatic difference. And yes, Dali can give you pretty stuff to put on your walls, but it isn't communicative art in the way that we understand it. And that, I think, is fair. That does focus on this thing that, you and I exchanged emails. It's sort of, I don't imagine you, we hadn't met until that point, I didn't imagine you to be a chatbot. I imagined there's a life back there. We have common, we have friends in common. We have acquaintances in the past. And so, there's that communication where we think, okay, this is a human spirit, and I touch a very tiny piece of it and have that conversation. Some of them deep, some of them shallow. And so I think the question is what we're doing mere defensiveness, which it might be. I mean, are we actually frightened that we're more like ChatGPT than we think? That it's not that ChatGPT isn't conscious, but that for most of our lives, you and I run around basically operating on a script. I mean, I think most of us on our commute to work and our conversations with people who we barely know, the conversations are very predictable. Our minds can wander, just blah, 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 blah. Is basically when you're on autopilot like that, are you that different than ChatGPT? Some neuroscientists would say, no, you're not. And actually, a lot of this is conceit. And I do put that in the book. That's one possibility, that maybe this is the humility square we have always needed. And certainly there's some humility in it. I think definitely that. But should we give up this idea of consciousness altogether? No, I think not. And the reason for that is we should look at scientific facts. One scientific fact is that basically almost every human being on Earth has that cogito ergo sum experience of consciousness. We communicate it to each other. We tell each other about it. That's a fact too. Now, you can tell me that's an illusion, but that's a mighty big illusion. And it's if you're going to tell me it's illusion, then your explanation needs to be why that particular illusion gets generated, rather than, as most neuroscientists are doing now, saying, no, we think consciousness is real. Now we just have to figure out how neurons firing makes it happen. And they're actually making some progress on that, although, as they say, right now, none of the theories are right. But they're kind of, they're trying to understand better this sort of emergent phenomenon of consciousness. So redrawing the line, moving the goalposts for sure, but we don't know right now whether we're doing it merely defensively or actually to gain some greater insight into who we are.
Yeah, because as we start heightening the standards for what constitutes human-like intelligence, we start excluding more and more humans, right? It used to be, oh yeah, you can string together language. I mean, even there, that eliminated some humans. And then when we say, oh, that's not enough, you have to be creative and you have to have a sense of humor. Well, that actually eliminates a bunch.
Sense of humor would write off enormous portions of the population. I happen to love a sense of humor, but I think it would be a wrong thing. Yeah, that was one of the things that I found in the book, which is, they always say that generals fight the last war. I think moral philosophers, I don't think we all fight the last war, but I think moral philosophers do. Moral philosophers geared up brilliantly to deal with the challenge that non-human animals presented to our ethics. People like Peter Singer, who said, no, you really need to think more seriously about the moral claims that non-human animals have on us, even if we don't say they're the same as human beings. And Singer doesn't. They nevertheless have much greater claim than we would acknowledge. And at that point, moral philosophers said, and two cheers for this. I agree with most of this. It can't be our DNA that gives us the moral status that we have. If Mr. Spock appeared tomorrow, he's half Vulcan. We wouldn't send him off to the mines, and probably we wouldn't send off Data from Star Trek either, even though he's mechanical. So it has to be a set of mental capacities, some set of things in common with what we have that is partly the basis for our moral status. I agree. But then they say, and therefore to say, if you're human, you get X rights is a fallacy. It's because you have these capacities that you get X rights. But as you pointed out, well, what about the person in a coma? What about the anencephalic child? Are these now just nothing that they have no moral claim on us? And I think most humans respond rightly in horror at that idea, declare it as literally inhuman. And I think we do that. When we do that, we're not, as some moral philosophers would tell us, just as bad as racists and sexists. This is mere speciesism. This is DNA Nazihood. It's like, no, this is the long battle through the 20th century for universal human rights for all human beings, regardless of race, regardless of creed, regardless of color, regardless of sex, gender, identity, but also regardless of intelligence, regardless of mental capacities. The eugenics movement taught us the desperate need not to condition rights on some subjective assessment of just how clever are you. And I think that when we say, oh, this is just as same as racism and sexism, we miss that. And the moral philosopher goes, well, look, we can't tell whether Greg has the capacities that, he really needs to let him inside the line. I mean, both he and Boyle are both getting on a bit, maybe they've lost a step. But you know what? Because it's so hard to draw the line, we'll just let them in anyway. Sort of like, you probably don't deserve to be in the club, but we'll let you in anyway. I find that a profoundly unsatisfying way of dealing with the issue. So for me, it's a two-step process. First, if you're human, you're in the club, regardless of your mental status or capacities. Partly because maybe one day you will be capable of it, the baby, and partly just because we've learned that making the opposite error leads to the horrors of the Holocaust. And in addition, if you demonstrate to me some set of capacities, and we will fight about what those are, then you're also inside our line. So I go for a hybrid approach, but I try and lay out the other approaches too.
Yeah, but it's kind of like saying, you get personhood if you're on our team, or if you kind of look like you're on our team, right? But I mean, aren't we, when we're defining personhood, we're always looking for some kind of similarity to us, whereas there might be completely different types of intelligence out there that are equally deserving of this status of personhood?
I think that's a very deep question, and I thoroughly agree. One of the things that I basically changed my mind about in writing the book is moral philosophers have tried very hard to come up with universal criteria, species-independent criteria.
They're very anthropocentric, right?
And yes, they're non-anthropocentric notions. And I honor their effort, and I think it's a good thing. But I think for a variety of sort of philosophical reasons, but also one very practical reason, we can try and abstract from, but never escape from, our humanness. And in the book, I give two imaginary examples. One is a telepathic species. For a telepathic species, the need to use these clumsy things that you and I are using to communicate, words, that's like animals grunting. That, far from being a sign of sentience, that would be a sign that they're mind blind and therefore outside their line. And they've kind of got a point if you're viewing it from their point of view. And then the other one is a sort of super intelligent machine intelligences who might think, well, can you give me all of the prime numbers out to, 99 digits? And if you can't, why on earth should I think? I mean, that's trivial. Like a machine right off the assembly line can do that. You can't do that. And so I think, we will always, any species that tries to reason like this is always going to be starting from its own ground. It's like the famous philosophical article, what is it like to be a bat? And I think we genuinely can't fully conceive of it. So, but reason can help us generalize it. Just like reason can say, I can never know exactly what it is to have lived life in another country at another time, as a woman, as a person who's gone through slavery. But I can really try hard. I can educate myself. I can immerse myself in history. I can read great works of literature. I can extend my empathy and my sympathy. I can reach out. I can ask to be helped to understand better. And just as we can do that with other people unlike us, I think we could do that by imagining, and maybe one day by building, entities that are unlike us.
Well, I mean, this idea of the imagination and the role of the imagination, I mean, you say that moral philosophy alone can't help us to navigate these questions. And you need to have exposure to something that will allow you to cultivate your imagination and your empathic capacities. And of course, literature is one way. And we all know that abolitionist movement was fueled in part by literary efforts, right? I mean, Uncle Tom's Cabin, of course, most famously, but all sorts of other things. Could be memoirs, could be fiction, and so forth. Today, it would be, movies and testimonials and other sorts of things. And you've been teaching law and literature, right, for a long time, and you reference a couple works in this. I mean, what is the role of literature? I mean, is there any way that we can dismiss those kinds of non-philosophical efforts when it comes to answering these questions?
Well, I think some philosophers would say that it's trivializing the philosophy does the work, and the literature or the moving movie or whatever is like the brochure that attracts you to the great drug that was designed by geniuses.
It's the
It's merely,
marketing campaign. It's
yeah, it's
the
just a PR
PR.
campaign, right? But the real work is done by the moral philosopher / scientists in the background. And I don't agree with that. I think moral philosophy has a vital role to play, but so does literature. I mean, one of the things about literature is our moral philosophy engines don't actually start going. They never get in gear. For those of you who drive manual and stick shift, it's sort of like, the
There's
clutch.
only a few of us left.
Right. There's the clutch is in, the engine's there, but it's not engaged. And it's that moment where the flash of empathy passes between two entities where you think, wow, I've read this, I've seen this, and this makes real to me, makes tangible to me. That it also allows us to engage in thought experiments, which are not the kind of experiments we want to do in reality. They might be unethical, they might be illegal, they might be just impossible. That I think broaden our perspective. And for me, at least, it's about as close as I've ever got to inhabiting the mind of another being. Maybe when you're raising your kids, maybe that's the only other time when you're or with your sweetheart, with your lover. Like there's a time where you actually do feel sometimes like you're one mind. But apart from those wonderful moments, which obviously we'll cherish, I think it's literature that allows me to be inside somebody else's head. And in particular, the literature that I talk about is literature that's actually about empathy and its limits. And so for me, that is going to be one half of the debate about AI is going to be a sort of dialectic between our empathy on the one hand and our ethics on the other. The empathy going, I'm feeling sympathetic to this, and our ethics going, well, let me check that out for you. And so I think that's going to be half of our debate. And so to me, the literature really helps us explore that.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you have your students read Philip Dick in your class,
And watch Blade Runner.
yeah, because you spend a lot of time on that text. I just finished reading this book called Antibot. Have you heard of this? It's a novel about a sort of a man-made sex robot, whatever. It was a really amazing book, quite good. And I think when you read books like that, it really does force you to think about these issues in a new way. And you also talk about, of course, Butler, right? So maybe you could talk a bit about those texts and why you chose those. I was waiting for more, right? So you started with those, and then I was waiting for more examples. But those were really central.
Bless your heart. I wish there were more like you. My editors were of a very different opinion. I would have loved to go on. Butler is absolutely fantastic. I mean, some of those of you who are your listeners who are Dune fans will probably vaguely remember the Butlerian jihad from the novel Dune. Sadly, not a phrase that Timothée Chalamet's elegant cheekbones ever uttered in the movie version. But the Butlerian jihad is this fictional crusade against machine intelligences, which is in the novel Dune. And most people who read that just imagine that he picked Butler for who knows. But actually, Samuel Butler, is one of the great Victorian thinkers, novelists, iconoclasts. The Way of All Flesh, which is his searing indictment of Victorian society, just a very painful but a wonderful read, exposing the hypocrisies of Victorian society. But he also wrote this weird sort of mirror utopia dystopia called Erewhon, which is nowhere backwards, or nearly nowhere backwards. And in that, he has a weird thing called the Book of the Machines, where he goes, look at the speed with which machines are developing. Is it not better that we stop them now and ban any further development. They look at what's happened in the last 100 years. May the world not last 100,000, a million more. Where will they become then? Let's stop them now.
And of course, back then, I mean, we're talking about, sewing machines, right?
Sewing machines. I mean, absolutely. Steam looms. The Babbage engine is about as computationally, the Babbage computation engine, beloved of cyberpunk writers, or cypherpunk writers, is steampunk writers, is probably the most complicated, and they never really finished that. So this is just incredible for him to say that. Now, it actually turns out that, frustrated AI researchers notwithstanding, Butler wasn't really talking about the possibility of machine intelligence. He was actually talking about the debate that galvanized his time, which is the debate over evolution.
Yeah,
and what he was doing,
sort of, what he was saying, anticipating John Searle's argument. And he was saying, this guy, John Searle, who's going to live 100 years later, he's basically just an anti-evolutionist. Right.
Well, and so I completely agree with you. In the book, I say the reason that I think the most fundamental reason why Searle is wrong is that Searle's arguments are exactly the same arguments that were deployed against the theory of evolution. I am conscious. You say I am evolved from pond scum. Pond scum are not conscious. Nematodes are not conscious. E. coli is not conscious. If I'm just fancy E. coli, that makes no sense. And the same argument can say, well, this is ridiculous. These are just binary circuits, ones and zeros. Ones and zeros can't be complicated. So complicated ones and zeros can't be. Well, that's fine, except, what's going on inside your head and what are neurons? And the point is, the anti-evolution argument, we could never have evolved like this because it's impossible to imagine a being where there's a difference not just of magnitude, but of kind, of actually emergence of consciousness. That obviously could not happen. That's the same argument that Searle was going to make, as you say, 100 years later about machines. And I think it's wrong for exactly the same reason.
Look, when we draw lines like this, we do it for a number of reasons. And you point out that one reason has to do with our moral sensibilities, but the other reason could be just pure expediency, right? Where we have determined that instrumentally, it might make sense for us to assign personhood to things that we know are not persons. And of course, we do this all the time in the law whenever we create a corporate entity. And of course, this doctrine has gotten a lot of criticism over the years. I remember when Mitt Romney said, corporations are people too. He got a lot of grief, but as a factual statement, I think that was a perfectly accurate legal statement to make, right? And so we have experience with creating artificial persons. Why wouldn't we want to potentially think about doing that also with these AIs, with robots, potentially with, hybrid organisms and so forth?
Well, that's very much the story of the book. When I started the book, when I wrote the article, which back in 2010, which I published in 2011, long time ago, the Jurassic era in AI time, dealing with these issues, I was focusing much more on the moral and the empathetic and ethical issues. And I came to realize that the certainly as likely, perhaps more likely way in which personhood would happen, whether or not it should happen, was that we already have artificial persons, they're called corporations, and that this would be a very powerful line for reasons, as you say, of expediency, of efficiency. We need to have something to sue when the self-driving car goes off the road, right? Or these are now, AIs are now running our companies and making decisions that are better, demonstrably better in terms of market performance than the human decision makers. At a certain point, we will start off, obviously, with the fiction, where Joe in the corner office, who still gets the private jet and the fancy perks, has his signature on the corporate documents, but everybody knows he's just a sock puppet. And the real that behind the scenes, how the AI is doing is making the moves. And that doesn't require any legal change. That just requires, it's effectively a shell company, right? It just requires a de facto arrangement. Back in 2016, the EU was already discussing the possibility of some limited form of legal personality for advanced robotic entities. Again, how to sue them. And they were saying, no, we're just thinking about this as lawyers. This is just convenience. And of course, there's outcry, and everyone goes, these are machines, not people. And they say, it's not the way we're lawyers. That's not the way we think about it. But human beings, and perhaps quite rightly so, go, yeah, but if you start recognizing them as having legal rights, even for narrowly economic and instrumental purposes, isn't there not a danger that you will continue down that line and end up by giving them all of the political and social rights that humans have? And that's obviously the fight that people have over cases like Citizens United. Yes, corporations, I mean, I think corporate personality is, I think, a good idea. I think society needs to make bets on innovations. Not all bets succeed. A corporate entity is a great way of narrowly parsing the loss and figuring out ahead of time how to divide it up, but also parsing out the potential benefits. It's a clever technology itself. It's a technology. Great, fantastic. But does that mean that it has First Amendment rights? Does that mean it has equal protection rights? And that's where I expected, when I went to the debates on corporate personhood and the rights that it implies, I expected it to be hugely useful. Obviously, we figured this stuff out. On the contrary, I mean, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on corporate personality and its attendants' rights is embarrassing, and in many cases just absent. It's just not there. I mean, even Justice Rehnquist, one of the most conservative justices ever until this current court, said that we made this decision to give corporations these rights with neither argument nor discussion. And I thought, well, I don't want to kind of repeat that history when it comes to AI, particularly when you look at the way that corporations have taken rights designed for very different groups.
Right. So, I mean, it's clear that you can, I mean, this line is not a bright line, right? I mean, you can have shades of personhood. I mean, corporations obviously have they have First Amendment rights and so forth, but they can't vote, right? And, you can't be accused of murder if you force a company into bankruptcy, right? So, I mean, they clearly aren't, they don't count as fully human. They're just human-like in certain ways, right?
Right.
And so presumably we could introduce gradations of personhood into both these biological and AI domains.
I think that's absolutely likely. I mean, to be honest, whether or not it will happen, I think it probably should happen for the great apes. I mean, I became convinced in researching this book that you can't just treat a chimpanzee, an entity which really shares so much with us in terms of being able to envision the future, being able to think about counterfactuals, being able to lie, a very human ability. To have surprise, apparently to express grief. I mean, it's always dangerous because we're always projecting, but there really seem to be lots of lots of aspects of our own consciousness there. And it's not enough just to say, well, I won't beat it with a stick. I mean, there has to be, I think, a greater recognition, but we're not going to give the chimpanzee all the rights. And I think the same thing, my prediction would be, and pretty much regardless of whether we should, and in the book I point out the reasons we should and we shouldn't have AI rights, I think we will move there in stages. And the first step will be some limited set of recognitions, maybe for efficiency reasons, maybe recognizing some aspect of self-determination, but not all the way to full personhood. And then the debate will continue, say, how dare you cut it off this? And this is but a narrow, this is no substitute for the real thing. Think of the debates about whether civil unions for gay couples were an adequate substitute for full marriage, for example. I think we'll have a cognate discussion about AI.
Yeah, I mean, you dug into this case involving Timmy the chimp.
Tommy,
right?
Yeah, Tommy the chimp.
Of course, we could obviously provide protections for creatures like Timmy by just having anti-cruelty to animal laws, right? We wouldn't need to necessarily recognize their personhood. But then what that means is that presumably, Tommy can't go and become a plaintiff, right?
Right, and that's what the
Yeah.
non-human rights movement, the movement for non-human animal rights, has really been pushing that and saying we ought to give them at least some rights, some kind of
Mhm.
standing. The famous law review article, "Do trees have standing?" This is like, do chimps have standing? And argues that even in some ways we already do. Like, for example, beloved pets can be the subject of a trust in New York. And so, therefore, they're like, well, if they can be the subject of a trust, the beneficiary of a trust, you're already giving them some kind of legal status. All the other rights must follow. And that doesn't follow, of course. Just because you get one of the sticks in the bundle of rights doesn't mean you get all the other ones. But I think for me, the big change in my point of view was that it wasn't enough just to say no cruelty, but rather that you start to think about, when I look at this being and all of its capacities, it actually has affirmative claims on me, not
Mhm.
not just no beatings, but you can't deny me. You can't basically hold me in solitary confinement. You can't just give me blank walls. I need stimulation. I'm a being with this incredibly rich sensorium, and it needs to. That really the idea, which in human terms we'd say human flourishing, right? That just putting you in a windowless cell and leaving you alone. It's 70 degrees. There's adequate food and drink. We would think that that was brutality. Whereas with animals, we go, that's treating them really well. And so I think for me, that was the shift that the non-human rights movement made. I don't follow them all the way down the line, but I do think that they make a very persuasive case on basis both of science and of ethics, but also of empathy. They engage my empathy. And this is what great lawyers do, as you know. It's not just getting the dusty old cases and making them march to your tune, which we do as well. But it's also employing your science, your empathy to tell stories in that amazing conflicting narrative, improvisational narrative that is legal argument, to say, no, this entity, Tommy, has a place in these dusty old law books, and let me tell you how his story is intertwined with ours. And that's what great advocates do, and people who move public opinion. And I think that that's what will start to happen with both some kinds of non-human animals, and perhaps one day, we don't know, with AI.
And of course, the locus of that conversation is the courtroom. Um, and I mean, that's kind of uniquely American in that sense, that we're having these conversations in the courthouse rather than in the legislature. I mean, is that where we should be having these conversations?
So, I mean, great point. I mean, the book I discussed, is this where we should be doing it? And I think the answer is yes and no. Courtrooms, as any lawyer knows, have profound limitations. They're also very good at certain things. They have weaknesses, they have strengths. And power and wealth, unfortunately, they operate in courtrooms as well as they operate in legislatures, but they operate differently. They operate in a different vernacular. Certain kinds of arguments are given boosts, right? Other kinds of arguments are deprecated. People who can just tell lies on cable news about an election find out that, to quote one of my wonderful colleagues, that they can't do so in a courtroom because you're not just allowed to make shit up. And a legal phrase. And so I think courtrooms they do have strengths, and those strengths are considerable, but they're not the answer. They're not the be all and end all. I do think, though, that other countries have done this. I mean, I think if you look at the history of cases being the crucible in which moral changes are formed, the Dreyfus case in France on anti-Semitism, the many cases in the British courts, including cases involving slavery, and I mean, I think that yes, there's something about. I mean, there's a reason that people write novels and put courtroom battles at the center of them. It is a stylized form of drama where your weapons are words and wit and logic, and yet also emotion. That's why Atticus Finch is such a great lawyer. He appeals to their logic, but also to their heartstrings. And so we will bring those issues up in court, and we already have with non-human animals. And I think to our benefit. Should we end up deciding them there? Probably not. For all kinds of reasons. Courtrooms have all kinds of limitations. Judges have all kinds of limitations. A lot of these should be democratically made decisions. And I mean, I think, to be honest, our current fascination with originalism, or at least our professed fascination with originalism, will make those conversations even more complex. Because whatever you might think about moral claims to personality, I think if I'm an originalist, I'm going to go, well, this really is not what either the framers of the Constitution or those who ratified it had in mind. And so, as an originalist, I have to say that any kind of rights for non-human persons have to be the matter for the legislature.
But of course, if you're a true originalist, then you wouldn't be supporting rights for corporations, right? 14th
Well,
Amendment.
that's a great question, and I get one that I do get into in the book. I mean, they have a number of fallback arguments. The framers of the 14th Amendment really were thinking about corporations when they wrote the Equal Protection Clause. And they maybe weren't thinking about corporations, but they used the word persons sometimes, and therefore we need to, as a legal matter, read that as broadly as we can, and that includes, there are arguments for doing that. But to be honest, I think that the originalist argument for corporate personhood, I think, is strong. The originalist argument that corporations are entitled to all of the constitutional rights that we have given them in the United States, I think, is very weak.
Yeah, you have an interesting discussion about the political divide, right, and how it might apply to these issues. And you point out that everybody wants to believe that there is a liberal position or a conservative position to every issue, but oftentimes it just turns out that this is ex post reasoning, right? I know Dan Kahan's written a lot about this, right? Is gun control a conservative thing or a liberal thing? Well, it kind of depends on what story you tell and in what country. But the liberal narrative could be that, hey, we keep expanding the circle of personhood, and so we should include all of these kind of person adjacent entities. But of course, they have a big problem with extending it to corporations.
Right.
So
yeah, and in the book,
conservatives are okay with that. So,
Right.
Would the expansion of the kind of circle of personhood, is that something that liberals will support, conservatives will support? I mean, both predictively and I guess, if you were to predict who's going to come in on what side of this, how's it going to shake out?
I think it's very hard to tell. I mean, I do think that if I start off with an audience talking to them about the gradual expansion of rights and thinking about, how it seemed weird at some points, people said environmentalism is a distraction from the real struggles going on. Non-human animal rights, that's a distraction from real, rights of real human beings. And now we're kind of like, maybe not right about either of those claims, maybe. And I sort of, when I frame it that way and I talk about the expanding circle of rights, just the Whiggish story that you described, then people go, next stop on the purring progressive monorail of enlightenment. But if I start the story with Citizens United, if I start with corporate rights, immortal, superhuman beings with neither consciences nor bodies, Baron Thurlow says that corporations have neither souls to be damned or arses to be kicked. Wherefore, there do you expect them to behave well? If we start it that way, I think it comes out very differently. The thing that I thought symbolized this best in the book is I quote a book from 2015, not that long ago, 10 years ago, saying, "Isn't it amazing that vaccines are now just a completely non-political issue? This is something that we can all agree on. It's just science." I mean, it's wonderful because it used to be highly politicized, and now everyone has agreed this is just universal vaccination is just the only thing that we could do. And the author even says, and to the extent that there are any opposition, it's liberals in Malibu who are freaking going to Whole Foods and they're all crunchy granola and they make some worry about pharmaceuticals and stuff. And the idea that in a mere decade, in a mere 5 years, if you look at the actual timing, that this would become one of the most divisive issues, political issues of our era, that poor writer could not have predicted. And so I think attempting to predict the politics of this It's very hard. Same for conservatives, by the way. I can definitely see a sort of social conservative, religious conservative set of arguments that say this is abomination, this is idolatry, this is hubris. These entities are neither in the Bible nor in the original understanding of the Constitution. Vade retro satanas. And I can imagine conservatives going, what we've always said is that the real morality is not this awful identity group liberalism that you moronic liberals have. The real morality is the freely choosing human mind. That's what Ayn Rand, that's what Milton Friedman, that's what Friedrich Hayek really focused on. And look, these are minds. This is the ultimate freely chosen human mind. This is, you want color blindness? How about species blindness? This is the next great stage of conservatism. And what's more, trickle-down economics always fits into every conservative story somehow. Think of the wealth they will generate, and that wealth will trickle down to their human progenitors. So I think I can see stories in which these become liberal causes, conservative causes, or some mixture. And I think it really depends, as you said, on very contingent things of how it gets brought up. The first issue, does this get pulled into pro-fetal rights, anti-fetal rights, pro-corporation rights, anti-corporation rights? We have many personhood wars ongoing. This is inevitably going to be drawn into them.
Now, when it comes to operationalizing this, I think the Chimpy story is easier for people to understand, because we're talking about an organism, right, that has a boundary of skin and, some organic integrity. And we can say, there it is. There's that creature that's, slaving away in the salt mines with an IQ of 60, right? Let's give it some rights. But when it comes to AI, it's kind of hard to figure out, like, what is it exactly that we're giving the rights to? I mean, even with a corporation, though economists will talk about it as a nexus of contracts, we conceptualize it as an entity, a la Maitland and Pollock and those guys. I mean, we think of it as a thing, and it has boundaries, right? And, whatever Henry Hansman's bucket, right? We know like what is part of the firm and what is not part of the firm. But when we think about an AI, like, I get it if we're talking about a robot, okay? And the robot has some autonomous computation happening and can kind of speak of itself, but most of these AIs, they live in the cloud somewhere, right? Like Siri. Like when we're talking to Siri, I mean, Siri's up there somewhere. It's going to be difficult, I think, for people to invoke their empathic capacity for Siri in the way that they might even for their Roomba. Right? Like if somebody kicks your Roomba, you could say, "Hey, you kicked the Roomba. Yeah, that's my Roomba. You can't kick my Roomba." But Siri or Sydney's up there somewhere in an amorphous form, right?
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I try and deal with that in the book. I mean, I think there's actually two ways it comes up. One is the way that you talk about, which is that we always have an attempt to localize consciousness. And so we tend to think of consciousness as being from the head, from the brain, sometimes from the whole body, from people who are like, no, a large portion of your nervous system's actually in your gut, and you should think it's a whole body consciousness, which is probably more scientifically correct than the pure brain model. And that we have to have something to focus on. And there it's almost like, it's just like I need a focal point. I mean, literally, like in terms of optics, I can't focus until I have a focal point. In terms of moral optics, I can't focus until I have a moral focus point. And so that, I think, is one way. So there's the moral optics point. I think there's a separate issue, which is, for myself, if I had to make a guess about AI that would more convincingly that would convince people that there was actually intentionality behind what it's doing, that its art does have experiences behind it, its words do have meaning. I think it would be what they call the embodied intelligence, where the AI actually has some incarnation in the world and learns as a child does, knocking over chairs, playing with blocks. And so it's not just I can manipulate strings of words about chairs and do so beautifully and fluently, but rather I know how heavy a chair is. I've sat in a chair. And the more that we do that, the harder it will be for us to say that's different than us. If you say, no, this is based on my experience of growing up for the last 20 years in, in the Center for Artificial Intelligence at MIT, CSAIL, well, why is that? Why is that less valid intelligence than the undergrad who's, been around for 20 years as well? And so I think at that point, the embodiment is not just a moral focal point, but actually serves to convince us that there's a commonality of experience between the two of us.
Yeah, but I mean, Teslas, for instance, I mean, they are exhibiting something like embodied intelligence. I mean, they have sensors and they're picking up data from the environment, except that all that data is being sent back to servers somewhere, right? So that if any individual Tesla crashes and get sent to the dump, right? The knowledge is still there somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if we think of sort of the AI behind Tesla, if we start thinking about that as some kind of person, it would be an unusual type of person. It'd be kind of like those organisms they talk about, like the largest organisms in the world are these, I don't know, these trees which clone themselves, and
Right.
these mushrooms that occupy
or the
5,000
hive mind,
acres.
the hive
Yeah.
mind of bees or ants, which, I mean,
Which means that if
clearly.
you kill a bunch of individual
Yep.
bees, it's no big deal because the hive survives, right?
And not just that, but the bees themselves indicate different sort of cognitive, to the extent you can talk about cognitive abilities of the bee, than the swarm. And I think that we certainly have experienced that with distributed computing, where there's different kind of emergent behavior depending on the number of nodes in the system. I mean, I think all of these things may come out. I think they are fascinating to think about. I mean, I think the Tesla. It's possible that ever more that entities that are designed, or rather machines that are designed for particular purposes, where they're made more and more complex and have more inputs and have more and more nodes, it is possible that those will start showing emergent capacities that were not designed for, but which actually surprise their designers. That happened even with chatbots. Some of the things that they could do were surprises to the people who created them, right? They just didn't see that coming down their side. So it's possible that it would be that. But I think that Norvig and Russell, two of the great minds on computer science and AI, sort of have pointed out that even the Turing test, with its focus on thinking like us, is the wrong way of thinking about it. They said when we developed heavier than air flight, we didn't do it by trying to imitate birds. Right? We learned from birds, to be sure, but we didn't have to design a plane that flaps its wings so like birds that even other birds are fooled, which would be the equivalent of the Turing test. And that's just a mistake. That's just a mistaken thing. So it's quite possible that the main thrust of AI engineering won't really be aiming at anything like what I'm talking about in the book. That when they talk about general purpose AI, what they mean is a machine that can do anything a human can do. It can write a sonnet, it can cook a souffle, it can soothe a fussy toddler, it can fly a plane, and it can write a symphony. But in none of those things does it do so with the kind of consciousness that is what I'm looking for. And that would be, under some definitions, if it did it as well or better than humans, general purpose AI, but it could be just a whole series of effectively custom designed chatbots for different capacities. So I think the issues that I'm describing may come up under these complicated computer architectures you're talking about. But part of that's going to be, is that what the designers are going to be aiming for? And a lot of the time, I think the answer is no. In fact, consciousness of the kind I'm talking about might be a bug rather than a feature as far as they're concerned.
Well, if we set aside the moral and empathic arguments and just focus on the utilitarian ones, I mean, would we need to introduce any kind of new law to make this work, or could we just make our corporate law elastic enough?
We certainly could. I mean, we could certainly.
New...
I mean, we don't even need to change the law, right? We can just, everybody can understand that Joe in the corner office is merely a figurehead, and they're already. I mean, look, as I say in the book, high-speed trading firms, stock trading firms, no human can actually make the decisions at that speed. These are not even, they're not even as smart as a ChatGPT. They're just programs looking for tiny deltas of gain and risk to do arbitrage on. But they have to have the power to make legal decisions. That's already a step down the road. And these things aren't like even pretending to any kind of level of true intelligence. And so we're already effectively delegating power. So it would be easy to do without a change. I think the interesting question is, do we want to have a custom designed personality form because we think there are some characteristics of this entity that need to be treated differently, in the same way as we treat a partnership differently than a LLC? Sort of is there something about it? Maybe something about the potential moral capacity of the entity itself. Maybe something about the danger that it poses. Maybe we think AI corporations are more dangerous than just regular corporations. So I think what we might want to do is custom to tweak it, just because we think there are special, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats presented by AI personality.
Well, I mean, I think about special purpose vehicles, right? And, I've spent a lot of time teaching topics related to them. And, when they first started off, you would basically buy a bunch of securities and then stick them in this thing, and then it would automatically make payouts. But it was relatively set at formation. And then they evolved so that they could start, buying new securities, right? And adding them to the pool and so forth and so on. And then you could do this kind of programmatically, where you could just set it up so that it would just kind of automatically, buy assets and then slice them and pay things out. But you'd still have these sort of trustees who would be responsible for. In fact, it was at Duke. I remember I took a course on this, right? And so in some sense, they are like these robots, right? And they have a legal status, and, they can sue and be sued. I mean, you obviously need human lawyers to do that, but they're kind of on autopilot already. I mean, can't we just use that type of structure?
Oh, no,
and just
we definitely could.
it?
And I think that's the path of least resistance. And that's often what happens. I'm just saying, it's we found in the past where you try and adapt one old legal form to some new purpose, it sort of works, but then you find, oh wow, all these ends are pinching. I mean, the very creation of special purpose vehicles, the creation of B Corps, whatever, right? All of these are because it's like, yeah, I've got this thing and I can kind of do it, but it's not doing what I want. I need something a little different. So if you excuse me, the sort of innovations in your own field, so sort of corporate expertise, has been precisely that, which is how do we need to tweak this, right? Sometimes that's just a tweak in the rules. Sometimes that's an entirely new entity, and I think that's likely to happen here too.
Now, last question. I mean, you talked a bit in the chapter on transgenic hybrids and chimeras. You talk about kind of the role of moral emotions and repugnance and so forth. And you say that there's a place for that. There's a role for that, perhaps in maybe not dictating what the law should be, but perhaps in raising questions and maybe stimulating discussion. And there are plenty of folks who, I think, Leon Cass in particular, that would speak about kind of the wisdom of these non-intellectual sources of knowledge. I mean, what is the role of things like empathy and disgust and repugnance? I mean, Martha Nussbaum's written about this as well. I mean, how should we be thinking? Is that something that we should try to stay away from, or is that something that we should pay attention to?
Well, I'm going to be very annoyingly academic and say I take a kind of middle position. I mean, one position is it's irrelevant. These are irrational feelings. The yuck factor is irrational until you can go away and give me some logical reason underlying your yuck factor. Then I have to treat it as irrational prejudice. There are people like Cass who, and I mean, there really are, it's a broad group. He was doing it in a sort of more sort of conservative, sort of social conservative context of worrying about biotechnologies. But there are people who've done it in lots of different areas, even the environmental area, in lots of areas, where they say that this is actually capturing something in our folk knowledge, that our folk ways are richer than the thin gruel of our moral theories. And I think there is truth to that there can be we can have inchoate hunch-like feelings of, I don't want to go there. And often afterwards, we're like, this is what was freaking me out. And actually, that's a good point, but I didn't have it well formulated enough at the time. That's how I think it should be used, as an intuition pump. I mean, Cass himself makes this, convincing argument about why our revulsion in certain forms of genetic engineering is, we should go with that and not on any deeper reasoning. And then, starts going off on other things. I was like, well, what other kinds of revulsion? Like, I mean, gay people, and at that point you're kind of like, yeah, well, maybe your revulsion is not something that that I'm actually going to be trusting myself to. And of course, people through the ages have been revolted by miscegenation. They've been revolted by homosexuality. They've been revolted by women voting. And so I think it's clear looking back that revulsion can't be the be all and end all. And we do need to some extent call it account in the courts of reason. But if our alarm bells, our intuition alarm bells are going off, for me, it's really time for us to pause and say, let's really think seriously about what might be under this, because there might be something deeper under here that we just haven't yet. Maybe the society or the technology haven't evolved enough so that we can see the thing that intuitively we're going, this feels wrong. And actually, we've got something there. And that's more the precautionary principle revulsion, which is the way, I guess, where I would put myself.
Well, I think Butler was right about one thing for sure that we can all agree on, which is that technology is changing a whole lot faster than we are as people. And so we need to somehow grapple with this. And the law is, I think, a place where this evolution can potentially be accelerated or perhaps held back. So thanks so much for joining me, James. I really appreciate it. The book is called The Line, AI and the Future of Personhood. Talk again soon.
And I will just add that you can, of course, I would love you to buy one from MIT, but you can download it for free. So if you just search online, you can. This is under a Creative Commons license, and I want to share everything that I write with the world. So everything I write is under a Creative Commons license, and anyone anywhere in the world who has an internet connection can get access to it.
I wouldn't expect it any other way, right, with you. So thanks again.
Thanks so much. This was a really fun conversation, Greg. Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.